The tape had been sitting in a cabinet for over a year. It wasn't damaged, it wasn't lost. It was simply there, filed away in a Motown storage room in Detroit, behind a label that no one was in a hurry to read. Inside it was a recording of Marvin Gaye singing, "I Heard It Through the Grapevine," a performance that the people who ran the most successful black-owned record label in American history had listened to, discussed, and quietly decided the world didn't need to hear. This is not a story about a man who overcame the odds. It's a story about what it feels like to know, with the kind of certainty that has no rational foundation, that something you made is exactly right, while everyone with the power to prove it stands in the way. It's a story about waiting, about the particular silence that settles over an artist who has already given everything and is now simply holding still, watching someone else decide what it was worth. Marvin Gaye understood that silence well. He had been living inside versions of it for most of his life. By 1966, Motown Records had perfected something that very few organizations in any industry ever manage. It had turned human feeling into a repeatable process. Gordy had built his label on a simple and ruthless philosophy that great pop music wasn't a matter of inspiration, it was a matter of craft. You hired the best songwriters in the country, you put them in rooms together, you gave them deadlines, and you let the best material rise to the top. The artists were, in this model, voices. Remarkable voices, often extraordinary ones, but voices nonetheless. The assembly line wasn't a metaphor, it was the point. For a certain kind of artist, this arrangement was liberation. You showed up, you sang what you were given, and if the song was good, and at Motown the songs were almost always good, you became famous. For another kind of artist, the arrangement was something else entirely. Marvin Gaye was the second kind. He had come to Motown in 1961 with ambitions that had nothing to do with what the label was selling. He wanted to be a jazz vocalist, the kind of artist who made albums that asked something of their listener, that left room for silence and complexity and the specific texture of a feeling that doesn't have a name. Gordy had looked at him, heard his voice, and seen something worth considerably more money than jazz. So Marvin sang what he was told. He was professional about it. He showed up on time, hit every note, and delivered the kind of performances that made A&R men look like geniuses. By the mid-1960s, he had a string of hits, a name that audiences recognized, a place in the Motown roster that was secure and valuable. And underneath all of it, steadily and without drama, he was accumulating a particular kind of frustration, the kind that comes not from failure, but from the distance between what you are capable of and what you are being asked to do. He had not yet found a way to close that distance, but in 1966, a song arrived that felt like the closest thing to a bridge he had ever been handed. Norman Whitfield wrote "I Heard It Through the Grapevine" with Barrett Strong in 1966. It was a departure from the polished romantic templates that define most Motown output. Darker in tone, more anxious in its emotional architecture, built around a kind of dread that most pop songs were designed to avoid. The narrator isn't heartbroken in the clean, recoverable way of a Motown ballad. He's paranoid. He's been blindsided. Something has been taken from him, and he doesn't entirely understand how. Whitfield brought the song to Smokey Robinson first. Robinson and the Miracles recorded a version. It was reviewed internally against the Motown quality control process and passed over. Not bad exactly, just not quite right. Then it went to Gladys Knight and the Pips. Their version was released in the fall of 1967. Number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 1 on the R&B charts, one of the biggest hits of the year. From a commercial standpoint, the story of Grapevine was over. The song had found its audience. There was no particular reason to revisit it, except that Marvin Gaye had recorded his own version before Gladys Knight's was released, and the people who heard it in the Motown offices knew, in the ambiguous and uncomfortable way that institutions sometimes know things they'd rather not act on, that what he had made was different. The recording Marvin made was slower than Whitfield's original arrangement, more spacious. Where Gladys Knight's version was urgent, almost kinetic, Marvin's moved like something submerged, patient and heavy and building from underneath rather than above. His voice did something in this recording that it didn't always do in the brighter material Motown typically gave him. It settled. It found the exact center of the lyric's anxiety and stayed there. Not dramatizing it, not performing it, simply inhabiting it with a completeness that was almost unsettling. You believed him, not because he was selling the emotion, but because he didn't seem to be selling anything at all. The paranoia in the song sounded, in his voice, like memory rather than invention. Whitfield heard it and understood what he had. Gordy heard it and understood what releasing it would mean. A second version of a song that had already been a hit for another Motown artist, from a label that prided itself on strategic, non-redundant release schedules. It was an organizational problem as much as an artistic one, and so the tape went into a cabinet. Marvin knew it was there. He didn't make a scene about it. That wasn't his way. Not yet. Not in 1967. He was still operating inside the logic of the machine, still trusting, at least functionally, that the people who ran it knew what they were doing. He had not yet accumulated enough evidence to conclude otherwise, and even if he had, the system offered no clear mechanism for protest. You recorded what you were given. You waited for the decisions to come down. You hoped that whoever was making them was paying attention. But he waited, and he did not forget. There is a specific quality to the kind of patience that isn't really patience at all. That is rather the absence of any available alternative. Marvin Gaye in 1967 was not serene about the tape in the cabinet. He was contained. There's a difference. He continued recording, appeared on shows, maintained the persona that Motown had built around him. The smooth romantic, the voice that could make any lyric feel like something that had happened to you personally. But the people who worked around him during this period described a man who was increasingly conscious of the gap between his public surface and his interior weather. He would finish a session and sit in the studio for long stretches after the other musicians had left. Not doing anything in particular, just present, in the way that people are present when they're waiting for something they can't ask for directly. Norman Whitfield kept pushing. He believed in Marvin's version the way he believed in few things in his professional life, and he was not a man who accepted institutional inertia without resistance. He brought it up in meetings. He argued for it on practical grounds. The recording was finished, it was polished, the commercial risk was manageable. Gordy was not opposed to releasing it. He was cautious. He wanted to wait until enough time had passed, since Gladys Knight's version, that a second release wouldn't look like the label cannibalizing its own catalog. He had reasons. They were, in the language of the record business, reasonable. But a tape in a cabinet doesn't know about reasons. It just sits there, accumulating the weight of things that have not yet been allowed to happen. In the late summer of 1968, Gordy authorized the release. There was no dramatic confrontation that precipitated the decision, no ultimatum, no climactic argument. It was simply that enough time had passed, the calculation had shifted, and the tape was pulled from the cabinet and sent to mastering. What happened after that was not what anyone had predicted. Not because the song's quality was in doubt, but because the scale of the response was outside the frame of reference that even its most ardent advocates had been working within. I Heard It Through the Grapevine entered the Billboard Hot 100 in October 1968. By December, it had reached #1. It stayed there for 7 weeks. 7 weeks during which it was the most played song on American radio. The record that disc jockeys reached for when they needed something they could rely on. The song that people heard in diners and cars and living rooms and stopped what they were doing to listen to. It became the best-selling single in Motown's history. Not Marvin's biggest hit to that point, the biggest single the label had ever produced. The tape that had been sitting in a cabinet for over a year turned out to contain something that had no precedent in the catalog of one of the most commercially successful record labels in the world. The obvious reading of this story ends there, with the vindication. The tape comes out of the cabinet, the numbers confirm what should have been apparent all along, and the machine recalibrates itself around the new information. But Marvin Gaye was not recalibrated. He took in the success with the particular equanimity of someone who has been right about something for a long time, and has therefore run out of the energy that vindication is supposed to produce. The 7 weeks at #1 didn't close the distance he had been feeling since 1961. They confirmed that the distance existed, that he could produce something of that quality, and that the default institutional response was still to put it in a cabinet and wait. He began to understand something about his position at Motown that he hadn't fully articulated to himself before. He was valuable to the label in direct proportion to his willingness to work within its structures. The moment he stepped outside those structures, the machinery stalled. He had to become, temporarily, someone who made noise, who insisted, who found allies and applied pressure, simply to have his own work heard. This was not a sustainable arrangement for a man with his particular psychology. He was not built for continuous confrontation. He was built for the recording booth, for the long hours alone with a microphone and a difficult lyric. The institutional friction cost him something that didn't show up on the charts. Grapevine taught him that he could win. It also taught him what winning required, and he spent the rest of his career calculating, often painfully, whether any given fight was worth the cost. The song outlived everyone who argued about it. It has been covered hundreds of times since 1968, appearing in films and advertisements in the kind of cultural context that transform recorded music into something ambient, something that exists in the background of daily life, without anyone having made a conscious decision to put it there. None of that was predictable in 1967, when a finished, completely realized recording was filed away because the timing was inconvenient. The tape in the cabinet is, in retrospect, one of the more quietly damning images in Motown's history. Not because what was done was malicious, but because it was so routine. Songs were deferred all the time. Decisions were made and revisited by committees of people with legitimate expertise and genuine commercial incentive to get things right. The process was rational. The result in this case was a year's delay on something that would eventually prove itself beyond any available argument. Marvin Gaye understood this. He understood that the process would, given enough time and pressure, eventually reach the correct conclusion. What he couldn't reconcile, what he would spend the next decade and a half trying to reconcile, was the cost of that delay. Not in commercial terms, in something harder to measure. The recording he made in 1966 was exactly the recording he wanted to make. It didn't need to be better. It didn't need to wait. It needed to be heard. And for over a year in a cabinet in Detroit, it wasn't. That's the part of this story that doesn't resolve with the chart numbers. That's the part that followed him.